Hey everyone, this is Dr. Darian Parker here on the Dr. Darian Parker podcast. And you may have noticed, if you've been listening for a while, that the podcast has taken quite a few turns throughout the years, but I think I'm really where I'm at, where I want to be. And as we renamed it the Dr. Darian Parker podcast. And one of the biggest things about this is to really provide really credible, reputable, reliable, reproducible, and valid information. And as an educator, an entrepreneur, mentor, I feel very compelled to try to put out information that is from really reputable individuals. And so I love having these guests that I have on, but every once in a while I'd like to do solo casts. And so today is an effort in that direction here. So, what are we going to talk about today? So, we're going to talk about what's the minimal effective dose for increasing strength and hypertrophy. So, why choose this topic? Why is this important? Well, one, I think it's really important primarily because in my field, especially within resistance training, there's always a debate or contemporary issue in how do you get the most gains or how do you increase your strength. But more than that, a subtopic is when you're working with clients and working with people, majority of people are not looking for peak level gains. They're not looking to reach their top of their genetic ceiling or become incredibly fit human beings. And there's a price to pay for that. But there's also this misconception that I have to work out a lot. Like I have to be in the gym hours and hours on end, lifting individual body parts per day and things of that nature. And that's just not true, that you have to do that in order to get some gains. So I like to dispel the myth that you need to be in the gym for so many hours, so many times a week in order to get the benefit. At this point, the evidence, at least what we have currently, the data are pretty overwhelming in terms of the lowest dosage that we can provide is extremely low to provide the benefit. And often with clients and people I work with and talk with and intakes is they're surprised by this because they're thinking I'm gonna have to make this huge commitment. And it's just too much because life is life. People are lifing all the time. And I try to be very sensitive to that, which is one of the big reasons why in my practice, I always just do half an hour sessions. I try to decrease the time and make it more efficient, fit quite a bit in that half an hour, but also keep the dose enough where there's a stimulus occurring, but also understanding that there doesn't need to be that much for there to be a gain and to try to wrap this around people's really busy lives. It's one thing I think we do a really bad job in the fitness industry is we push you need to get out there, you need to work out, you need to be there out there regularly all the time. It's consistency, and consistency is important. But for a lot of my clients, a couple of times a week is usually enough of really pinpointed specific intensity, enough that there is a stimulus and that we're not overdoing it, but we're not understimulating them as well. So the purpose of today is to go over the most relevant research that's out there for a minimum effective training dose required to increase your strength. In particular, in this instance, is 1 rep max strength, and also in hypertrophy, which is increase in muscular size for that. So it's going to be more of a technical podcast as we come through here, but I think there's 4 different meta-analyses that I want to go over to really focus on driving home the point that the minimal effective dose for increasing strength and hypertrophy is so much lower than you think it is, which means you can spend a lot less time in the gym. And this is, again, for everyone who listens to this, watches this, who are avid fitness exercisers, you may be thinking, man, well, I just like being in the gym a long time and it's a sacred space for me. I totally get that. Really awesome. But you are an anomaly. You cannot think of yourself as normal because the majority of the population does not think like you. And being a trainer for 25 years, unequivocally, I know most of the clients do not think like you. And if you're in this business like I am, you want to cater to what is going on in the general population and in mass and what's happening. As people like myself who have been avid exercisers, I continue to be an avid exerciser, but I have greatly decreased my volume of exercise because I follow the science for it. And it has just produced wonders for me. I have so much more time in my life to do other things that I find passionate, but also just following the science and knowing that I don't have to actually do that much to get elicit the gains that honestly would be just fine to get the benefit from it. So let's go into this. Let's talk first about a study with the lead author, Androulakis Karakis, and this is from 2020. And the study's goal is basically answering the question, what is the minimum resistance training dose required to still provide a meaningful increase in one rep max? So big part of this too is teaching research literacy, right? So let's say you get an article like this and you see it online. For most people, they're just going to skim through and look at the abstract or look at the results of the study. And what we need to be really careful about here is getting like study strength and finding really great studies. So you'll see in everything I've done here is we're reviewing meta-analyses. And why are meta-analyses or something like longitudinal studies much better or stronger indicators for the general population than a single study? All right. So a meta-analysis is looking at a collection of studies, often, 10, 15, 20, 30, sometimes way more studies for that. This gives us a better idea of whether this will generalize to the larger population. So those of you out there who are looking and say, oh, I read this study and it tells me that if I do these exercises, I'm going to produce X, Y, Z. That's one study. You also probably haven't looked at the deeper look at the studies. You haven't broken down what the methodology is, the sample size, the rigor involved in selection of everything here. What do the studies say? What are the gaps in the research? Who funds it? All these different things are a part of it here. So as I go through these, I'm going to take a deeper dive here into that here. So in this study, again, we're looking at a systematic review and a meta-analysis of what is the literally bottom barrel minimum dose required to produce one rep max strength increases. Okay. So this study from 2020 is widely considered some of our best evidence for evaluating how little strength training is actually needed to produce measurable increases in one rep max. One rep max being the amount of weight you can press or lift or pull one time for that. So the prevailing thought is that traditional resistance training programs are essentially 3 sets of something, maybe more, 3 to 4 times a week, the traditional idea for this. And what I love about the minimal effective dosing research is that we're really catering to a general population who needs to hear this information. We're not catering to really fit people, right? But I think there is a lot of application too, because often really avid gym goers overdo it. They spend too much time in the gym, too much time providing stimulus. And often what occurs is diminishing returns, a lot of irritability, a lot actual decrease in strength and overall fitness, and which actually mirrors a lot of sedentarianism. But also what it does is this helps fit people, very fit, avid exercisers, to cut down their time exercising and to create a better relationship with health and fitness. But again, I think it's important for certainly people, the general population, but definitely has a lot of implications for people who are avid exercisers as well. So some initial points I made before while I was looking through this was, although this is considered the gold standard for MED or minimally effective dose, there's still a heavy lack of diversity in subjects, which makes the results more generalizable just for men. So when looking at this study was done primarily with men, okay? But so certainly not for women or other ethnic groups. So if we're trying to generalize the results of a really great research study that this has been done, meta-analysis, it's really generalizable primarily for men. We cannot say that this is very generalizable to women because the subjects were not women. They were primarily not women. So we have to take that into account. Okay, again, understanding the sample is really important. Studies that are looking at 1RM and not hypertrophy. Again, so we're not looking at muscle size here. We're increasing muscle size. We're looking at strength. Okay, the difference is between the amount of force produced to lift or pull a maximal resistance. All right, so how much am I benching? How much am I doing lat pull down, or how much am I doing bicep curl, tricep extension, whatever, any of those types of things. How much force can I produce one time for that versus increase in the size of muscle? So again, we're looking at 1 rep max strength here. This is one is different, which I like includes trained athletes, but not necessarily elite or advanced participants. There's a delineation between that, and certainly not for untrained populations. But you will see in further research I discuss that there is quite a bit of research in untrained populations here. Now, in this study, we'll also see that there were a tremendous amount of studies that were considered. So over 2,000 studies were considered to be part of this systematic review and meta-analysis. Okay, so, but actually only 6 studies were included. Now, you may think to yourself, okay, this went from 2,000 to 6. This may indicate like a weak amount of studies or not a great return on that. But I would also say on the other side that this implies a lot of methodological rigor, which also then implies a lot of strength to this. So there was a lot of criteria and parameters set to say, hey, we want to make sure that this is as rigorous as possible, and that this includes the criteria that's going to give us the best possible idea of what's going on here. All right. So in this, the terminology we're looking at here and is basically training volume. Okay. So, and we'll talk about what that training volume means. Terms like powerlifting, 1 rep max strength, low volume, minimum effective dose. You'll see these throughout the course of this. So the selection of this was, the criteria was for these studies that they had to be randomized trials or controlled resistance training interventions with clearly defined comparison groups. Okay, so having randomization, why does this matter? Well, it reduces your selection bias. The control group allows for some causal inference here, and strength training changes can be attributed to training primarily. Okay, not just chance or motivation or testing familiarity alone. We always do it with randomized trials are the best way, because we're able to actually suss out what's actually happening from the intervention that's happening here. So what was excluded in this study? Well, observational studies, cross-sectional designs, case studies, or self-reported training logs. Okay, so this actually excludes a tremendous amount of fitness literature. It's not saying that these aren't good studies, but in terms of the criteria for this, it excludes a tremendous amount of these studies, and also that the studies had to be greater than 4 weeks in length. So any studies that were 1 to 2 weeks long were excluded. So why is this important, right? It's important because especially we see a lot of changes and interventions with resistance training usually starts to take effect after 1 to 3 weeks. So if it's happening within a 1 week time frame here, we're not going to get we aren't going to measure much at this point. So that greater than 4 weeks is going to allow us to see what has been elicited from the intervention here. So that also eliminated a lot of the studies. When we also look, again, this includes resistance trained men. We're looking at, in terms of the subjects here, that they have experienced resistance training for equal to or greater than a year. So they're more experienced lifters, but they're not advanced lifters. Okay. So they have a regular exposure to barbell machine resistance-based training. Again, not including any untrained or untrained groups, primarily because if we give anybody who's untrained just a little bit of something, almost anything, they're going to make an improvement here. But what happens when someone's actually seasoned? And what do they need to do in order to just have the minimal effective dose here? So we're looking at this. So it includes a low dose training group, which were defined as 1 set per exercise per session, to look at how little is enough to elicit strength gains, 1 rep max gains here. And then report 1 rep max strength outcomes in the selected exercises for this. So again, the studies had to report direct 1 rep max testing, not estimates, and exercises like squat, bench press, sometimes deadlift here. Again, just to reinforce, over 2,000 studies, and in fact, 2,629 studies were screened, and only 6 studies met the inclusion criteria, which I just talked about here. Again, to recap, healthy resistance-trained men, typically greater than 1 year of training experience, trained but not elite. Okay. Again, as another note, this review did not include any women. And the evidence in this is insufficient to conclude if these results are generalizable to female lifters or highly trained elite lifters or also people of different ethnicities for that. Again, so this is an area, a gap in the research, as we would say, that needs to be studied, which would help strengthen the scholarly consensus here. Okay. So when we look at the training intervention, right, because we're doing science here, a study, we provide an intervention here. So the intervention here, the common theme among this was that a single set per exercise per session. We're looking at roughly around 6 to 12 repetitions using a load of 70 to 85% of 1 rep max. This is performed 2 to 3 times per week with, and this is a key, a high intensity of effort, meaning that we're going to volitional failure, which is basically 2 to 3 reps before failure or complete failure or momentary failure, lasting roughly 8 to 12 weeks. So strengthened the amount of time here, 8 to 12 weeks. So when we're looking at this, the results of this are pretty startling, I think. And we're looking at this in terms of, again, 1 rep max. So a mean increase on average, trained men gained about 27 pounds in 1 rep max within the minimal protocol. And we are looking at about a 95% confidence interval. And the true average gain lies between 18 and 35 pounds. So what are confidence intervals? We're looking at this. Basically, we're saying if we repeated similar studies many times with similar populations, again, if we did a bunch of these studies, we repeated this study with trained men who are up to a year or more and their experience with resistance training, provided these exercises with this criteria and this population, 95% of those studies would produce an average effect within this range, okay? An average effect within this range. So again, we're saying we look at this for overall 1 rep max strength, about a 27-pound increase in 1 rep max strength over the course of this, all right? So that's pretty significant when we're looking at that. So let's look at the specifics here. So in squat 1 rep max, the mean increase was 38.54 pounds, okay? When we look at this, on average, the squat increased roughly about 39 pounds. So the true effect is likely somewhere between, when we look at this 95% confidence interval, between 19 and 58 pounds for that is what we saw overall. Okay, so when we look at the mean, it's 39. So somewhere between 19 pounds and 58 pounds on squat, we saw an increase in that and 1 rep max strength with a mean increase of 39 pounds. That upper level especially is pretty significant and substantial for trained lifters. And why is this significant? Well, when we have trained populations, it means that they have experienced the very large, quick benefit you get from resistance training. So if you start from nothing and you introduce a stimulus progressively over time, you're going to see a huge increase in strength and endurance very quickly. Now, as you get closer and closer to being in a fitter state, your genetic ceiling, you're going to see smaller and smaller increases. So what does this mean when we're looking at this is that even in trained people who've been training a year or more, if we just provide 1 set of an exercise, right, 6 to 12 repetitions, 70, 85% of load, and training to close to failure, that there's a statistically significant increase in that person's ability to increase their strength. And overall, about 27 pounds when we look at this over the course of all the exercises. What does that say? I mean, technically, you could basically just go to the gym a couple times a week, do 1 set of most exercises, and see gains. This flies in the face of doing multiple sets over and over again, regularly, constantly, to produce significant gains. Now, as you'll see in other research, in terms of hypertrophy, you do need more sets in order to produce muscular size. But if we're just talking about strength, and in this case, 1 rep max strength, 1 set of different resistance training exercises, 1 time with close to failure produces significant gains and 1 rep max strength. So we just showed you with that. So on bench press, when we go, so bench press, and we looked at squats here, right, for that. So what's interesting to understand here is I'm losing my place here. So I just looked at squats, yep, and then bench press. So as we go across this here, we're seeing that this single set is really, really incredible here. And so strength range can occur with far less volume than traditional training programs prescribe. So the idea that you need multiple sets to increase strength and create progress is not the consensus. But again, I think the big key here is intensity matters. There has to be an appropriate level of intensity. Going to momentary failure or volitional failure on a single set is important to create this minimally effective dose effect here. So what's some other points here? I think overall this meta-analysis, while it's considered our gold standard here, I do think that I would love to see this research study done with women as well. We need to see if there's any biological variation here. More than likely, my speculation is that it'll be pretty similar. But I also like to see this with different ethnicities as well to just get a more well-rounded idea, because we can take the results of this and we could more than likely do a better idea of generalizing this to trained men. But we cannot generalize this to women. Women were not included. We cannot generalize this to different ethnic-based populations because, one, ethnicity reporting seems to be, at least in my research of this, almost never done. And it's essentially the ethnicity of the people who are in the region that they're in here. And so this is overwhelmingly based off of that. So what we can see, I think, with this in a meta-analysis is that for trained men, healthy trained men, and generally the ages of these men are between 18 to 35. So healthy trained men between 18 to 35, generally speaking, can perform one set of upper or lower body exercises and do this 2 to 3 times a week and up to momentary failure or volitional failure and produce significant gains in 1 rep max. What does this mean for the general population, especially for this particular population, is that you can have very low volume. And this is bottom of the barrel. Imagine going to the gym and you were doing a dumbbell chest press, right? Or you were doing machine chest press. One set, going to essentially failure, you're good. Move on to the next exercise. Go on to squats, leg press. Move on to shoulder press. One set, done, you will experience significant increase in your 1 rep max strength. That has tremendous implications, generally speaking, because we've spent so much time telling people they need to get in the gym regularly and build this really big habit. But we do know that bottom of the barrel stimulus actually works really well and gives people time and takes away some of the effort barrier. That's one of the biggest issues with exercise participation, is overcoming the effort barrier. And so if we're telling people they need to spend all this time in the gym, we're actually doing a disservice to them and not giving them the very best information. And we're not basically giving them relief too, because if people feel like they have to spend a lot of time on something to get a benefit, and there's a lot of effort, there's an effort barrier for that, people often choose the lesser of those two things. So this is something we really need to get this out. I thought the study was methodologically pretty well done, and the results are not evidence of like weak amount of studies and that they wish there was more studies. I think it's evidence of a lot of methodological rigor, but it's also not definitive either completely because of the sample, the lack of women in it and different ethnicities, but it's generally some of our strongest available evidence we have. All right, now let's look at our next study, which is by Schoenfeld, Ogborn, and Krieger. Sorry for that there. But this is a dose-response relationship between weekly resistance training volume and increase in muscle mass. So another systematic review and meta-analysis is the Journal of Sports Sciences, again in 2017. What's the core question of this research? Is there a dose-response relationship between weekly resistance training volume and muscle hypertrophy? Or does doing more sets per muscle group lead to more muscle growth? So does doing more sets per muscle group per week lead to more muscle growth. Now, important designation here, not per session. Does doing more sets per muscle group per week lead to more muscle growth? So let's look at the study design here. So we have 15 studies, which produced 34 treatment groups. All right, but because many studies compared multiple volume conditions. So we have 34 treatment groups. Total participants across the studies over 400 subjects, which is great. This one's looking at mostly untrained or recreationally trained individuals. So this is not even an experienced population, certainly not elite level lifters. Most were young men with very few women. So no reporting of ethnicity. But again, most likely representing the demographics of the location of the places where the studies are done. The study duration was greater than 6 weeks, equal to or greater than 6 weeks. Most were between 6 and 12 weeks. The focus is on hypertrophy, increase in muscle size for this. So we're not looking at strength here, but increase in muscle size, okay? So when we look at this, the study design is done weekly set by volume. So low volume will be considered less than 5 sets per muscle group. Moderate volume would include 5 to 9 sets per muscle group per week. High volume, greater than 10 sets per muscle group per week, okay? Some additional design considerations. We have heterogeneity, basically meaning that there was a moderate heterogeneity across the studies, meaning that the programs were different, intensities different, exercises were different, and populations differed a little bit. So even despite all of this heterogeneity, there was a very consistent outcome for this. So all of this to say, too, is that we're standardizing the volume as sets per muscle per week. All right, so again, this is a very important distinction for that. Now, measurements and methods review. So this included studies, included MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging, as the gold standard of measurement of increase in muscle mass and size, ultrasound, which is reliable when it is standardized, DEXA scans. So this is not just purely muscle, lean mass, muscle thickness measures, and some anthropometric measures, which are less precise here. MRI, ultrasound are direct assessments of muscle size, which is why they're much more towards the gold standard of this. But even though there were lots of different measurements here, they're very high quality, which means they held up across all the methods here. So what do we find out here? What are the results here? So when we have a group that when we see less than 5 sets per week, per muscle group. So let's look at this and say, let's look at chest, right? Let's look at chest and say, let's say chest press here. Did less than 5 sets of chest press, we had saw it elicited the smallest gains. 5 to 9 sets per week elicited moderate gains, and then equal to or greater than 10 sets per week equals the greatest gains, okay? So basically what we're saying is the more sets, up to 10 or a little bit more than that, produce the greatest hypertrophy for that. So more weekly volume equals more hypertrophy, okay? So in novice and intermediate populations, higher weekly set volume produces greater hypertrophy. Now, also, novice untrained resistance training participants make significant changes neuromuscularly and muscularly due to never having a stimulus. So one of the things I think that is so much different than what we talked about before is we could give untrained people almost anything for a stimulus, very, very low stimulus. Something's going to happen. They're going to improve and have some level of gains here. But with our more advanced exercisers here, we really can't assess that. I'm looking at because there's experience there. And when we look at, in terms of, when we're looking at this here, this has to be explored a lot more to provide a full picture and provide a delineation for that. So this same exercise, what I'm trying to say is doing this same research study with advanced exercisers for hypertrophy reasons would be interesting to see for that as well. Now, we're going to go to more research about this, which we'll talk a little bit more about this. But if we look just specifically at this, doing this with advanced exercisers, would we get the same outcome in terms of gains? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here. While the stimulus is also the focus, we have to also take into account recovery mechanisms as well, which play a very large role when we talk about hypertrophy. Have we standardized what the recovery methodology is for that? So more sets obviously equal repeated exposure to a stimulus, but also we provide more gains with an adequate recovery process as well. So knowing what that would be plays a role as well in it. So we looked at the first study from 2020, which was looking at increase in 1 rep max strength. And this was with more of your trained population, like experienced but not elite lifters. And we see an increase in 1 rep max through bottom barrel basement, single set to failure methodology to produce increase in 1 rep max. This one here with Schoenfeld, we see that we use untrained populations, again, who could do almost anything, and you'll produce a gain. But when we're talking about doing 5 to 9, greater than 10, we see the more volume that we provide, the more exposure we have, the greater the increase in muscular size. Now, this is to a point, but we do know if we want to get the most out of increasing hypertrophy, right, we need to do more than 10 sets per week per muscle group for that. All right, so let's look at this next one, which is Basvale and others, and this is a systematic review. The effects of different resistance training volumes on muscle hypertrophy. You may be saying, we just talked about muscle hypertrophy, right? We did do that. But what's different here is this is one of the only research studies done with experienced lifters, as most studies are done with untrained novice lifters. Again, we're looking at hypertrophy on this one. We're not looking at 1 rep max strength. Last study we did, we did meta-analysis with Schoenfeld. This was untrained folks. This one from 2022 is experienced lifters for hypertrophy, okay? Also, this only denotes in this study male lifters, so a lack of female lifter point of view is a gap in the literature. I've noticed with all of this research that I've gone through is that it's mostly male dominated. It's either a very tiny percentage of women, maybe 20% of women are selected for this, or it's just purely male population, and mostly in the 18 to 35 range, so younger people. Not to say there isn't research on older adult populations, there are, but in looking at the younger populations here, this is primarily composed of men. And again, we have no ethnicity reporting, so we don't know that either, okay? So this is something to think about. So the other things to look at here in design, after analyzing 2,083 resultant articles, studies were included if they met the criteria. 1, studies were randomized controlled trials, all right, with the number of sets explicitly reported. Interventions lasted at minimum 6 weeks. Participants had a minimum of 1 year of resistance training experience, and participants ranged from 18 to 35 years. Studies reported direct measurements of muscle thickness or cross-sectional area, and the studies were actually published in peer-reviewed journals. So a lot of criteria here, which is great. And the randomized control aspect is really important. One, because participants are randomly allocated to receive a new treatment or a standard treatment or no treatment at all, which would be your placebo group. But we have to have a comparison group in there. So having it for randomized controlled studies is really important here. Again, having that greater than 6 weeks is important so we can actually measure a change that's occurring. We need enough time for that to occur as well. And again, you heard my points about the population here. And we're using direct muscle size measurements such as magnetic resonance imaging or ultrasound. So MRI or ultrasound here. Muscle groups which were analyzed were the quadriceps, biceps brachii, and triceps brachii as well. All right, so these are very muscle-specific analyses and not pulled with like whole body hypertrophy here, okay? So what do we find out here? Okay, so what are we looking at here? What is it telling us here? So let's look at this information here, okay? So when looking at this overall, And reviewing over 2,000 papers, basically there were only seven that actually met the criteria. Most of these studies had around 20, 30 participants, 6 to 8 weeks, roughly about 12 to 18 weekly sets, to about 20 to 27 weekly sets per muscle. So, not extreme bodybuilding volumes, but we are talking about moderately high volume and already trained men in this case here for that. So, again, looking at this, our quadriceps results and our meta-analysis show us that there's really no statistically significant difference between moderate and high volume, right? So the effect size is really small, a statistical value of 0.19. So the interpretation, basically increasing quad volume above 20 sets, did not significantly increase hypertrophy compared to just doing, let's say, 12 to 20 sets. Okay, remember this. In the previous one with untrained, we had the most gains when we were doing 10 sets or above, but primarily just 10 sets, maybe in the 10 to 15 range here. So when we start getting into higher than that, higher than 10 sets, moving up to 20 sets in terms of quadricep hypertrophy, we're not seeing a statistically significant increase in hypertrophy. Let's look at the biceps brachii, right? Also, no significant difference between moderate and high volume, with a p-value statistical significance of 0.59. So a very small effect size difference. Right? Statistical significance is 0.05 for that. So this is even weaker evidence for a benefit of greater than 20 sets. All right, so going from, let's say, 15 sets to 25 sets did not produce any meaningful greater hypertrophy with 6 to 8 weeks. Now, pretty interesting, we look at the triceps brachii of high volume, let's say above 20 sets, produced significantly greater hypertrophy. So it had a statistical value of 0.01. So times where 0.05 or below is statistically significant. So the effect size, the difference favored high volume for triceps. So this, in terms of this study, this was the only muscle group showing statistically significant benefit from higher volume. Pretty interesting. I'm curious, again, why the triceps were different from the biceps and the quadriceps. I would have liked to have seen other muscle groups as well. But if you look at this and take this on a whole, that essentially, if we are looking at this in terms of the dose response curve, it's essentially flattened. So you have the minimal volume here for hypertrophy. It seems to be best, I would say, around 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week. Again, there's no huge benefit of increasing volume significantly in trained men to improve hypertrophy when you start getting into 20 sets or above. It's essentially diminishing returns. There's really no value in terms of increase in muscle size. So it looks like the sweet spot for trained men in this case would be somewhere between 10, 15 sets per muscle group per week, not per session, per muscle group per week for that. So what makes this, what's the realism behind this is that essentially if you're a trained man, about a year plus in experience in weightlifting, you could go work, do quadricep work and do basically around 10, probably, let's look at it, make it a scale even larger, 10 to 20 sets. I'd say 10 to 15 sets per week. You could basically go to the gym a couple times a week, knock out, 10 to 20 sets of quadricep-based training, and you would get the most hypertrophy that you could get. So if you wanted to spend 25, 30, 40 sets on your quads per week, it's essentially diminishing returns in trained men who are experienced lifters, okay? So not a huge benefit if you're trying to just add more volume for here. So basically what I see here in real life is often regular gym goers believe that more is better, right? But the meta-analysis for trained men shows us this is not the case, okay? You could spend a lot less time in the gym, do, let's say, 10 to 15 or 10 to 20 sets of a particular muscle group and get the maximum hypertrophy from this. Doing more does not equal more. So again, it's important to think I'm always mentioning trained men because this is the population and does not represent women or other ethnicities. Although there weren't a lot of studies, again, even though it's over 2,000 were looked at, 7 were picked, this doesn't generalize to a larger population completely. However, again, the methodological rigor was there in the selection process, which strengthens the results. But we need to be careful in terms of looking at this generalizing to the larger population. All right, so these studies are short, sample sizes are small, and muscle growth in trained individuals typically tends to be slow. This is something to think about with this here. All right, we're moving towards our last study here. And I really like this study. It's by Pellin and others in 2025, looking at volume and frequency, looking at this. So this is what I like about this study quite a bit is that it does include men and women here. And so the other studies that we were going over do not include any women. It's basically essentially just men. It just looks at men. So we're generalizing to men and either trained men or untrained men. And this one, the title, The Resistance Training Dose Response, Meta-Regressions Exploring the Effects of Weekly Volume and Frequency on Hypertrophy and Strength Gains. So I really like this study. It's very recent from 2025. Okay, so what I like really a lot about this is that from 2,058 studies that were looked at, 68 studies, which is a much bigger meta-analysis, were chosen. So huge amount of studies here, right? In this, the average in terms of gender makeup was 79% male, 21% female. Pretty good, right? We're getting a better mixed population here. The mean age was around 25 years old. So again, we're looking at much younger people. And the training status is untrained to moderately trained and actually including some advanced lifters. So we're getting a much better generalizability to the population because we have better sample sizing. We have more studies. We have a better cross-section of subjects, and we have a better cross-section of status, trained level status, untrained, moderately trained, some advanced lifters for this, okay? So the objective is to examine dose-response relationships between weekly set volume, training frequency, and outcomes in both increase in muscle size, hypertrophy, and muscular strength. All right, so this addresses gaps in prior research regarding frequency volume in more diverse populations. We also see, again, much larger number of studies, which is going to strengthen it and have better generalization to the larger population for it. Again, and also just to recap, a good mixture of training status on this. So both untrained, trained, and some advanced training. So what's the design of these studies, of looking at these 67 studies, right? So the exercise selection is a mix of single joint, multi-joint movements. Single joint movements would be like bicep curl, which is flexion, extension at the elbow. Multi-joint, we're looking at something, let's say quadriceps, we're looking at squats, or let's say chest press, multi-joints based movements here. Muscles groups and studied, and when we're looking at these meta-analyses of all these studies is, for example, quads and upper body example, biceps, triceps, compound lifts. Most protocols used a range of moderate to heavy loads. So I think that's important. So moderate to heavy loads, and many required sets to perform near failure. So again, remember this, when we're looking at minimal effective dose and things of that nature, what seems to be a key element is if there is enough intensity to elicit a response. All right, so the stimulus has to be enough, the intensity has to be enough to elicit a response. So what we're seeing over and over again in these studies is that many of the studies are requiring the participants to perform the sets near failure or close to momentary failure. All right, so this is not controlled completely rigorously, which, this is pretty common in human training research, but the fact that this was done is showing how important that this element, the intensity, is to this. So When looking at this, a unique aspect of the Pelin study is how they quantify dose. So we're looking at direct versus indirect sets. So direct sets are counted as one set when the muscle measured was the prime mover in the exercise. All right. So think about it like in a bicep curl, the prime mover is the biceps brachii. Okay. The opposite muscle group is the triceps brachii that relaxes during the muscular contraction. So a direct set is counted as when the muscle measured was the prime mover. Indirect sets counted as 0.5 sets when the muscle was involved, but not the primary target. And non-direct sets were counted as 0 for this. All right, so let's look at mostly in terms of how long this was done. We see a very consistent theme, right? 6 to 12 weeks for the study. Again, enough time to elicit changes from the intervention. The measurement methodology, again, mostly ultrasound, MRI, the gold standards here, direct measurements here were mostly used, and the strength measurement of we have, for strength and looking at 1 rep max, and then so bench press, squat, leg press. So again, looking at increase in muscle size through ultrasound, MRI, and then 1 rep max strength done through bench, squat, leg press, things of that nature. So you see the other articles, other research studies was either just looking at 1 rep max strength or looking at hypertrophy. We're looking at both here. Again, strengthens this tremendously when looking at this here. So what are the key findings that we have here for that? Well, one thing we're looking at here is the volume effects, right? It's a positive dose response. So more weekly sets equaled more hypertrophy. There was diminishing returns, though, to a certain point. So early gains were essentially, when what showed the largest relative hypertrophy was anywhere between the first 10 to 15 sets per week per muscle group, which substantiates our previous study, right, that we looked at, Baz Valley, where anything above 20 was a diminishing returns, right? And while there may be some level of increase, it was so small as not statistically significant here. So again, the volume effect seems to be very consistent, that those first 10 to 15 sets per week per muscle group shows the biggest benefit. And this is untrained, trained, and some elite level people. So we look across all the training status of different people, we're seeing a very similar effect. Obviously, we know that untrained people, they make big jumps pretty quickly. But as a person becomes more trained and more consistent with what they're doing, often people are looking for, how do I get more and more out of this? Usually the answer is to have more volume. But the research is telling us that increasing that volume beyond that 20 set per week, per 20 sets per week per muscle, pretty much does nothing for that. So there's a small to moderate effect sizes at high volume, but the largest changes are seen at just moderate volume. So the idea of spending so much time in the gym, doing one body part per day or a couple body parts and hammering out tremendous amounts of volume, there's really the data are not supporting that this is what should be done in terms of real life lifting in order to produce the effect for that. So it basically also presents this idea of a plateau zone for trained and moderately trained lifters, that at some point, if you continue to increase your volume per week, per muscle group above 20, that essentially you're wasting your time in terms of increasing strength and hypertrophy. And you could be doing other stuff. You could get more time back. One thing I love about my practice is I feel like it gives people so much more time back in their lives, and they don't have to spend all this time in the gym. That's a huge point of this, all right? So let's look at the frequency effects. So frequency alone had minimal impact once total volume was accounted for. So if you spread the volume over more sessions per week, did not strongly increase with hypertrophy. So if you said, hey, I'm going to go 4 or 5 times and do just a couple sets here, didn't really matter for that. Technically, you could just go to the gym and maybe once or twice a week, maybe twice a week, knock out a total of 15 sets per muscle group. So think about it this way. Potentially, if you wanted to just use that 10 to 15, and let's say I just wanted to do 10 to get the effect, you could essentially go to the gym twice and do, let's say, chest press, 5 sets of chest press to close to failure, twice a week, done. That's it. That sounds like a much better plan for most people who are living very busy lives than spending all your time in the gym trying to get gigantic and doing set after set after set after set after set. Okay, so frequency just had minimal impact when accounting for like volume. So I found that completely really interesting as we look at those volume effects. The strength effects, positive effects on strength gains. Again, diminishing returns were more pronounced than hypertrophy. So very high weekly volume, sometimes plateaued strength increases, right? So moderate volume, often sufficient to produce most of the measurable strength adaptation from the intervention here, all right? And strength results, slight benefit in spreading sessions for strength, but this is more probably to recovery management and optimizing your performance. When we look at sex differences, was there any? Because there was female, 20% females, 21% to be exact. There was really no explicit subgroup analysis by sex reported. Based off of previous evidence, it's probably more likely that you'll probably experience very similar results between sexes. And the difference would be absolute gains will probably be larger in men due to baseline muscle mass considerations for that as well. So there we go. There are several studies we've just gone over to look at what is the minimal effective dose necessary to produce significant gains. So let's summarize this. So we look at it here. When accounting for, again, trained men, primarily, this is what we have currently here. And there's lots of gaps in this. We need to start studying a more mixed population here. But if we look at this through the meta-analysis, we know the data are telling us currently that 10 to 15 sets per week, per muscle group, is the sweet spot for measurable increase in 1-rep max strength and hypertrophy. Going above 20 sets or more per week per muscle group generally produces a flattened curve or diminishing returns, no statistically significant increase in hypertrophy or 1-rep max for that. So we went through all of that to tell you that, but it's important to have good research literacy, to understand the design of studies, the measurement methodology, to understand also what are the results telling us, and are these generalizable to a larger population, or is this generalizable potentially just to a specific group of people? And according to this, looking at it, it's mostly generalizable to trained men and untrained men. Very small percentage of women, no ethnicity reporting. So lots of gaps in terms of the subjects used. I would love to see more of that. But again, choose meta-analyses whenever possible because they're going to strengthen the research. Also longitudinal studies as well. But yeah, that's what we got. What's the minimal effective dose? I just gave it to you, at least for that population. Hope you enjoyed this podcast episode, and I'll be back with more interviews with experts in bodily systems and more topics related to things such as this. All right, thanks, everyone.